Hello everyone and welcome back to the good stuff. We are continuing the 1858 match between Adolf Anderssen and Paul Charles Morphy that took place in Paris, and things are not great for Adolf Anderssen, as this is already the 10th game of the match, and the score is currently 6 wins Morphy and only 1 win Anderssen, and as you know, it's first to 7 wins. So if Morphy wins this game with the black pieces, then Morphy takes the match by just crushing Anderssen here with a score of 7-1. 2 more draws were played, but the draws do not count in this match. So very tough position for Anderssen, but he has the white pieces, and it's very interesting what he will choose for his basically last attempt at taking down Morphy. He will once again go for the opening he tried. It is of course the grand opening, and it is A3. In theory also known as the Anderssen opening, but some refer to it as the grand opening. So what's different in this game than in the previous two? Well, we already mentioned that at that particular point in the game, Anderssen played d4, but this time he's gonna castle, and that's gonna be different. If I'm not gonna be explaining anything much up until that point of the game, so if you haven't been following the match from the beginning, do start, and you will have a better grip on what's happening. So here we have e5 by Morphy, but basically Anderssen is trying to play a certain line of the Sicilian defense with the white pieces. So here we have c4, knight to f6, knight to c3, and d5. Morphy, of course, grabs the center. We have captures, and now e3. We have bishop to e6, Morphy again placing his bishops on e6 and d6, knight to f3 attacking the pawn, and just bishop to d6, Morphy defends. We have bishop to e2, and now Morphy castles. And now in the previous two games where Anderssen employed the grand opening, he always played d4, but now Anderssen just castles here, and this is his improvement for this game, and it is now as of move 8 that we have a completely new game. So Morphy trades on c3 as he did in the previous two games. We have b captures, and now f5. And now his position is well, just very enjoyable. His bishop pair is very nicely placed here. He can play e4 at any point, open up this dark square bishop. He can bring the queen into the game. He can bring the rook into the game. So very easy to develop here with black. But Anderssen obviously has something prepared. He plays d4, and Morphy happily advances the pawn to e4. Now gaining this diagonal for his dark square bishop. We have knight to d2, and now rook to f6. You could jump in with the queen right away, but it doesn't really do all that much. Simply h3 or f4, and well, there's just not much black can do here. So instead, rook to f6. Morphy wants to bring another attacker into the game, and now Anderssen plays f4. He says, all right, this diagonal is gonna remain closed, and if you capture on f3 en passant, then knight captures, and this knight will be an excellent defender here. Now, if anyone is better here, it's definitely white. I have a better center, and your bishop pair will not be all that impressive. So instead, after f4, Morphy says, all right, I'm not capturing that. I'm just gonna play rook to h6, and now I might consider bringing my queen to h4, depending on what you play. And here Anderssen plays g3. He stops it right away, although you could play bishop to c4. It's a very interesting move. Now you can't play queen here because just bishop captures on e6, but it's a very interesting line. And now if bishop captures on e6, rook captures, queen to b3, and what do? You have to defend the rook somehow, either with the king or with the queen. Doesn't really matter. We're gonna capture on b7 and win the rook here. So if Anderssen played, for example, this bishop to c4 move, Morphy would have to wait with his plan of bringing the queen here. But okay, Anderssen not interested in that. He wants to play knight to c4 instead. So here g3, taking away the h4 square from Morphy's queen, and now knight to d7. Morphy now is ready to bring the rook to the knight to f6, then maybe to g4. We have knight to c4, now ready to bring this knight over to d5 square. Not interested in this bishop because this bishop isn't really doing anything, and Morphy now says, all right, that's not happening. We're gonna eliminate this knight. So bishop captures. We have bishop captures with check, king to h8, and now rook to a2. Anderssen says, all right, now my rook is also guarding the second rank, so not going to be a problem defending this position. Queen to e7. Morphy is ready to bring the other rook into the game, and now a4. Anderssen grabs more space on the queen side. We have knight to f6, and now queen to b3, putting pressure on the b7 pawn. So c6, Morphy defends it, and now bishop to e6, going after this f5 pawn, but Morphy just says, all right, thank you for giving me a free move, rook 8 to e8, and now you can't really capture the pawn, because if you capture the pawn, g6, and the bishop is trapped. So Anderssen has to bring the bishop back. We have bishop to c4, and now knight to g4 by Morphy. And it's a tricky position to play. The knight is attacking e3, the h2 pawn is attacked twice, so white really has to thread carefully here, and Anderssen does. He plays rook to g2. It is by far the best plan. You want to play bishop to e2 and kick away this knight. The problem is, if you play bishop to e2, you're going to lose the h2 pawn. So first rook to g2, so the rook remains here, defending the h2 pawn, and now we're preparing bishop to e2. So rook to b8, now Morphy with the idea of opening up the b file, and the bishop to e2, attacking this knight, and now Morphy just brings it back. He says, all right, for the moment, let's bring the knight back. I'm gonna bring it back into the attack when the opportunity will be right. And now c4. Anderssen says, all right, we've calmed down everything on the king side. Let's now improve our position in the center. And what do you play here? Morphy starts with b6, and now bishop to b2 by Anderssen. This is a great square for the bishop, and if the position opens up, could be very unpleasant for Morphy's king. We have queen to f7. Now, okay, you can't play a move like c5. Maybe white had some ideas of doing this because the queen is on b3, so Anderssen brings it back, and now Morphy bishop to e7. We have bishop to c3, and now Morphy says, all right, well, we could just continue remaneuvering our pieces with nothing really happening in the position. I'm just going to play rook to g8. I'm going to play g5, bust open the position. I'm going to win the last game of the match, and that's it. I win the match, and I'm the greatest player in the world. But Anderssen says, all right, if that's what you want, I'm just going to play a5 here. A totally, unrelated move on the queen side with a pawn. We have bishop to d6 by Morphy, and now a captures on b6. We have a captures, and now rook to a1. So by allowing this... So by playing this maneuver rook to g8, and with the idea of playing g5, he allows Anderssen the a1 square for the rook, having an open a file, and now the rook can be lifted over to a6, and even if, for example, g5 captures and rook captures, then even the rook to a8 will be possible at some point. And Morphy doesn't care. Here, a modern player would probably play something calm, like a rook to b8, push b5, create a pass pawn, and play on that. But Morphy says, no, let's just finish this quickly. Not that. Morphy plays g5. And Anderssen happily captures. We have f captures on g5, rook captures on g5, and now there are a lot of interesting options here for Anderssen. One is particularly nice, but for some reason Anderssen just doesn't like this choice, and that's c5. c5 is just a killer move. Now asking black, what do you want to do? The problem is, if you capture, and we're going to discuss this, because if you capture, white captures, and now this diagonal opens up. And for example, if bishop captures here, we just play rook to a8 with check, bishop to f8 now, and now we play bishop to c4, and black is completely busted here. There's really not much you can do here. And of course, if you capture the bishop, then we just capture with check, and we pick up the black queen. Rook captures, queen captures, and that's it. So here, after rook captures on g5, instead we have rook to a8 check by Anderssen, not going for this c5. Okay, after c5, you of course don't have to capture. I didn't mention that you could play bishop to c7, but then rook to a7, and still black's position is just terrible. The bishop can't move. We're threatening c captures on b6, and it's just very, very difficult to play this with black. But okay, after rook captures on g5, Anderssen prefers rook to a8 with check. We have rook to g8 blocking, and now queen to a4. So not as straightforward as the line we've shown. Morphy captures on a8. We have queen captures on a8, and now queen to e8. Morphy just offers a queen trade, and Anderssen happily trades. We have captures, captures, and only now c5. So Morphy, of course, doesn't capture. Then he would lose a piece. If captures, captures, you're in check, and you lose the bishop here. So Morphy has to play bishop back to c7, and now comes bishop to c4 by Anderssen. And this is Anderssen's problem in most of his games against Morphy. He wants to create a masterpiece. That's not his only problem, but it's one of the problems. Here, just going for d5 right away is sufficient. So you should really play this. The king is in check. The king moves d6, and already it's completely winning position for white. If Morphy, for example, moves the bishop, you can't move the bishop here because then we just win, so you have to keep an eye on the d8 square. And now let's say bishop c4 check, king to f8, and now rook f2, and there's really not much you can do. The pawn and the bishops are covering all of the squares around the black king. It's just impossible to hold. If you try rook h5, defending just d7 attacks the knight, and there's no good square for the knight. So just really bad. If you go here, then you allow c captures on b6, and if you go knight to g7, then again c captures on b6, and once the bishop captures, now of course bishop to b4 check, and there's nothing for the black king to do. All of the squares are taken from him, and you have to start by giving away material. c5, we're happily going to capture this, and now after the bishop captures, d8 brings the queen into the game, and that's it. So really an interesting line, but Anderssen for some reason doesn't like d5. Anderssen plays bishop to c4, and now, okay, now he is threatening a lot of things, but Morphy Morphy starts to run with his king. He just plays king to g7, and now it's not as clean as if you've played d5 right away. So first c captures on b6 by Anderssen. Again, he doesn't like d5 for some reason. Bishop captures, and now rook to b2. Now he wants his bishop pair to stay fully operational, and this pawn can always start marching forward. He's attacking the bishop. If the bishop moves, he's bringing the rook to b7. So his attack has merit. There is no question about that. So bishop to c7 and rook b7. This is the position Anderssen had in mind, and probably why he decided to wait with that d5 pawn push. Now the bishop can't move, the knight cannot move, the rook doesn't really have all that many squares, but the king can move, and so Morphy moves the king. King to f6, he impins, now the bishop can move, and now bishop to b4. Now he waits with the d5 move, because then the king comes to e7, and it's not that clear. So first bishop to b4, now he takes away new squares from the black king, and now comes rook to g6. Now Morphy doesn't really have a good move. He has to play some like h5, h4 and try and open up the position here. And if that's possible, then he's gonna get some sort of a active game. But if not, it's all Anderssen this game. And here again, not d5, bishop to f8. Anderssen just taking away all of the squares from Morphy's king. If h4 comes, then it's just gonna be great. So Morphy starts with h5, but now king to f2. You don't wanna wait for h4 with your king on g1, so king to f2, and now h4 by Morphy. So you can see it's although the position is beautiful to look at, it's not as straightforward as that d5 right away when we discussed it. So here g captures on h4, and Morphy goes rook to g4. He now wants to start claiming those pawns. We have h5. Now Anderssen is ready to push his pass pawn to victory. Rook to h4, and now h6. The bishop nicely covers this pawn. Rook captures on h2 with check, king to g1, and now rook to h3, going after the e3 pawn. But Morphy says, Anderssen says, nope, that's not really a threat, just bishop to f1. And you can never capture here because we just play h7, and there's no stopping this pawn from queening. So after bishop to f1, rook to g3 check, king f2, and now Morphy plays rook to g4. And I think Morphy is really trying, even though his position is worse, he's really trying to win this game. If he wanted a draw, he could play rook to f3 check, and it's pretty much a guaranteed draw. King to e2, and now bishop to g3. And now we use the f2 square to stop the pawn. If h7, rook f2 check, the king has to move, and you can't move away from the bishop because then we capture the bishop with check and play rook to h1 and stop the pawn. So you have to play king to e1, go under the mask of the bishop, and now rook h2 comes with a discovered check. After the king moves, now we play rook king to g6, attack the pawn twice, and now we're gonna win the pawn. And also the h8 square is nicely covered. So that's the point. But Morphy goes rook to g4 instead. I think he wants to keep winning chances alive. Bishop to c4 now by Anderssen, and now comes rook to h4 by Morphy. Again, if Morphy wanted it, he could play f4, and this is, I think, the most straightforward way, because now, for example, if you play h7, then it's a problem. Then you could play rook to h4, and now what do you play here? Okay. the pawn is now defended, but bishop to g8. Sorry, the pawn is attacked, but bishop to g8 defends the pawn. F captures on e3 with check, king captures, and bishop to d6 check. Here is one way for black to unwind. And now if rook to f7 check, king to g5, we're gonna play bishop to g7. Now threaten to queen our pawn. So knight will capture, rook captures, and now king to f5. We're gonna play rook to f7 check, king to g6, and now rook to d7. We go after the bishop to f8, for example, and it's a well, it's a drawn endgame. The material is completely equal. The bishops are of opposite colors, so this is definitely a possibility here. So f4. Definitely a good idea for Morphy, but it doesn't allow him to push for the win. So he plays h4, rook to h4, and now comes bishop to g8. Again, a very interesting line is just bishop to g7 with check. And now what do you play here? If you capture this with the knight, then h captures and white is winning. You're either queening the pawn or king captures, and then you lose the bishop here. So what you would have to do after this bishop to g7 check is hide the king on g6, and now white would play bishop to e6, and we would get this very, very interesting position where black would very much struggle to survive this position because the knight cannot move. The capture is never an option due to the line that we've shown, and bishop to d7 is coming to just win the knight. So there's that. But Anderssen again goes for the more aesthetically pleasing line. He goes for bishop to g8, and now Morphy finally brings the bishop into the game. We have bishop to d6. Attacking the bishop here. Bishop captures, knight captures, attacking the Anderssen's rook here, and now rook to d7, attacking the knight. We have knight to e8, knight to b5 is by far the best, but it's a very tricky position. We have knight to e8, and now h7 by Anderssen. We have king to g5, and now rook to e7, going after the knight here. Knight to d6, and now rook to e6. With these few attacks on the knight, we will now claim the c6 pawn, which would not be possible if the knight was on b5 like we discussed. But okay, knight to c4, we have rook captures on c6, and now knight to d2. Morphy still says, all right, my position is way more active. You're never queening this pawn, and it's going to be very, very difficult for you to defend this. And now we have king to e2 by Anderssen. Maybe not the cleanest way. The cleanest way would be rook to c1, and then, for example, after knight to f3, then only then do we play rook back to c7, because if we play d5 right away, then f4 and the Morphy's position is very much tenable. If he captures, we're going to play king captures, and then now, well, it's even black who's winning. If d6, we're just going to play rook to h2 check, king to f1, now king to g3, and there's no defense against rook to f2 checkmate. The knight covers the e1 and the g1 squares. So what you would have to do here after knight to f3, like I said, is just play rook to c7 and then start advancing the pawn, and then it's perfectly fine. But okay, after knight to d2, Anderssen played king to e2. I mean, this is just one crazy game. And now Morphy attacks the king. Rook h2 check, king to d1, and now Morphy again doesn't go for f4. It's like Morphy doesn't like f4, Anderssen didn't like c5, but for some reason, it's definitely the best here. If captures, this is now gives Morphy the most chances to fight in this game. But he played knight to f3, and now comes rook to c7. Anderssen now defends the pawn, and now the bishop can be activated. So what do you play here? Here we have king to g6, now comes d5 by Anderssen. We have f4 by Morphy. Finally, this move is happening. E captures on f4, and now pawn to e3. Morphy's pass pawn is also incredible here, but there is one move that wins the game for Anderssen. So I could have made a pause the video moment pretty much in every move in this game, because it's such a well, funky looking game, but I decided to do it for this one because here it's the only move that wins the game for Anderssen. So feel free to pause the video here and win the game for Adolf while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the only move that wins, and it shouldn't be all that difficult to spot, because if you allow e2 check, you're just lost. So pretty much the only way to avoid this is to promote this pawn to a knight, which is possible, but it would yield only a draw. But rook to e7, the simplest, is the correct here. Rook to e7, congratulations to everyone who found this, and now there is no more chance for Morphy here. He plays it the best way possible. He plays e2 check, rook captures on e2, and now rook to h1 check, which wins him the exchange. But after king c2, knight to d4 check, king to d2, knight captures, and king captures. He has a rook and king against bishop, king, and 3 pawns. And 3 pawns is just a little bit too much. So king g7, king to e3, we have rook to e1 check, king to d4, and now rook to f1. If he can get at least one of these pawns off the board, then he can fight. But Anderssen will, of course, not allow this. Rook to e1 check, king to f5, we have rook to d1, now bishop to e6. He even offers this pawn to Morphy, because if the pawn is captured, then king f6 is enough to win the game. There's not much you can play here. Rook d2 would be played, let's say f5, and now black will just waste moves, king f7, king e7, and now any pawn will queen, and that's it. So after bishop to e6, we have rook to d4 by Morphy. Now saying, okay, at least I'm keeping an eye on this pawn push, but just king e5 by Anderssen, rook to d1, and now f5. We have rook to h1 by Morphy. Now comes f6 with check. King captures on h6, and now king to d6. So the only thing that Anderssen could mess up here is if he somehow stalemates Morphy, but as you can see, he brought his king all the way to d6, and that's going to be very hard for Morphy to achieve. So rook to a1, we have king to e7, rook to a7 with check, bishop to d7, and it was now in this position after bishop to d7 was played on move 77 that Paul Morphy resigned the game, and a second victory for Adolf Anderssen in this match. So we will not be ending the match with this game. There will be at least one more, because now Anderssen is starting to bounce back. He already has 2 victories, and that's what he meant by this quote above the board. He had dinner with Morphy. I think he had the dinner with Morphy after every day when the games were happening. I don't know if it was exactly every day, but pretty much. But this is something that he mentioned to the company at the table the day prior to the last game, that he's glad to have already 2 sheep in safety, meaning that he already has at least 2 points against Morphy, which, you know, it's not nothing. I mean, it's Morphy he's playing. So yeah, like I said, at least one more game, and here you resign because after, let's say, king to g6, you have to play something. We just play f7, and there's no playing this. Okay, you have to check if maybe you can get a draw from this endgame, but you can see that you know, just move the king guards these 3 squares, and you know, it's just a very simple win. We're just gonna push the pawn to victory. So yeah, after bishop to d7, Morphy resigned, and Anderssen is maybe back in the match. We'll see what happens in the next one. His next one is really super exciting. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it and that you're enjoying the match so far. Third time Anderssen employs the a3 opening. We now call it the grand opening. He scores a win. First it was a loss, then it was a draw, and now he improved it all the way to a win. So maybe now, if he can survive the next game with the black pieces, he's gonna again throw a3 at Morphy, because it seems that this is the opening that Morphy is having the most trouble with, because it just allows you so much. You can choose to do anything, and well, he just, you know, got all tangled up in the possibilities, and Anderssen came out on top. But yeah, okay, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Richard Yarnell, Michael Sprague, David Kimura, Dale Cook, and Mazin Elsarag for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the Morphy saga until it ends. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.